afternoon, everybody. I'm Jane Kamensky. I'm the director of the Schlesinger Library. I want to welcome you on behalf of the Radcliffe Institute and Schlesinger, one of its major programs, on this, the first big public event of Schlesinger's 75th anniversary year. So we've actually invited you to a birthday party, and there will be plenty of food at the reception afterwards. We're taking in this 75th anniversary year a year-long look back at our origins, at the journey we've taken since 1943, at how far we've come, and especially taking stock and thinking about new directions in future. Calling the year 2018 our 75th anniversary actually looks to Schlesinger Library's second of three foundings. The first was the collection that served what was initially called the Harvard Annex and then later Radcliffe College in the late 19th century. But the anniversary we're celebrating this year, dating to 1943, in the middle of the Second World War, some 23 years after American women won the right to vote, was the moment when the Radcliffe alumna Maud Wood Park, class of '98, donated a large collection of suffrage-related material to create what was called the Women's Rights Collection at Radcliffe College. This was a big collection for its time. It included 30 cartons of manuscripts, more than 300 books and periodicals, some assorted objects, including possibly the suffrage wagon that our photographs show pulling up to Longfellow Hall on Women's Equality Day, August 26th of 1943. That's the anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment through the final state. The Women's Rights Collection was that year given a proverbial room of its own, which was a small padlocked space in Longfellow Hall, now part of Harvard's Graduate School of Education. The first year for which we have records of the use of the Women's Rights Collection is 1949, and 7 researchers used it that year. So here we are 7.5 decades later. Schlesinger houses more than 4,000 manuscript collections and 130,000 books, a number that grows every day, enough to fill 3 capacious vaults on site and much more in Harvard's remote depository. We are a vibrant living library, building on strengths like the June Jordan collection that came to us 15 years ago and provides the genesis of today's event, and building on those strengths to strike out in complementary directions as well as to break new ground. We will break new ground literally at the end of this anniversary year, late next fall, when we thoroughly renovate our main building to improve our public learning and workspaces. And we break new ground intellectually with acquisitions like one you might have read about last week, the papers of Angela Davis. Thank you. Our work in the library is meticulous and detailed. So just to give you a sense of scale, the Angela Davis papers are over 150 cartons, nearly half the size of that whole founding collection. And it'll take nearly 2 years of full-time staff work to sort, describe, preserve, stabilize, and ready Angela Davis's papers for researchers. Our work, in other words, is staff-intensive. The depth of training that our curators, archivists, processors, staff leaders, and reference librarians have is known throughout the industry and is, among other things, I think one of our key competitive advantages in the world of special collections. There are a lot of Schlesinger staff here today, and if I could ask that you would stand up so that we can applaud what you do, please. Our work is also expensive, and many of you here today number among our supporters, for which I want to applaud you. Thank you. The acquisition of the Angela Davis papers is important not only because of Davis's iconic qualities, but also because of the ways that they reflect the library's strategic priorities to diversify the collections by race and ethnicity, and also by ideology and political commitments, with Angela being one of the people who has broken new ground intellectually and politically and in her activism and moved the rest of the world forward. Before I turn over the introduction to today's event to my colleague, Ken V. Phillips, Schlesinger's inaugural curator for race and ethnicity, let me call your attention to a couple of other upcoming events that connect with our anniversary year and with the Radcliffe Institute's broader commitment to support the study of women, gender, and society. So on the back table, you will see a card that looks like this. It's for our 75th anniversary exhibit in Schlesinger's lobby gallery, 75 objects telling 75 stories about 75 years. You'll also see a card that looks like this that shows you all of our Schlesinger events for this anniversary year, except for one that we scrambled together so quickly that it didn't make the card, which is an event this coming Monday night called Me Too, Truths and Consequences, that brings Harvard faculty expertise to bear on this fast-moving, hot-button moment and movement. Later in the spring, on April 5th and 6th, a Thursday and a Friday, will be our annual Radcliffe Institute Gender Conference, this year in connection with the Institute's Citizenship Year. Its title is Who Belongs? Global Citizenship and Gender in the 21st Century, to which I think June Jordan would have wanted to go. So with that, I will turn it over to Kenvi and welcome you to this celebration. Thank you.
Good evening, morning, afternoon. I don't know what this time of day is. As Jane said, thank you, Jane. I am Kim V. Phillips. I am the curator for race and ethnicity at the Schlesinger Library here, and I want to welcome you to this wonderful evening that we are about to have. Evening full of poetry, commentary, and conversation that we've planned for you to celebrate the living legacy of June Jordan. And there are lots of things that I need to do, so please bear with me. There are several people that I want to acknowledge who were very instrumental in making this day happen for us. And chiefly first is Dr. Joshua Bennett, who I will give you a full bio when the panelists come up, because he will be moderating the first portion of the evening. Joshua led, Alicia followed, Jane Kamensky was a strong member of the committee that organized this panel, and then of course I sat there with them. But for our panelists today, I'm gonna introduce you all in no particular order. I don't know if you wanna come up. Yeah, come on up. Because I wanna get out of the way so we can start this conversation. I'll start with who's first, which is Imani Perry, who is the Hughes-Rogers Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, where she's affiliated with programs in law and public affairs and gender and sexual studies. She's the author of More Beautiful and More Terrible, The Embrace and Transcendence of Racial Inequality in the United States, and Prophets of the Hood, Politics and Poetics in Hip Hop, as well as numerous other titles, and one that she's most recently published about centering around the Negro National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing, which she told me is really exciting, so I can't wait to read that. Solmaz Sharif was born to Iranian parents, holds degrees from UC Berkeley, where she studied and taught under June Jordan, and June Jordan's Poetry for the People and at New York University. She's received many awards, and has been a Stegner Fellow, and is currently a lecturer at Stanford University. Mariame Kaba is an organizer, educator, and curator who is active in numerous social movements for prison abolition, racial, gender, and transformative justice. She is the founder and director of Project NIA, a grassroots organization with a vision to end youth incarceration, and co-founder of numerous organizations, including the Chicago Freedom School, Love and Protect, and most recently, Served and Punished. And then Joshua, our organizer extraordinaire, is the author of The Sobbing School, which was the National Poetry Series selection and finalist for the NAACP Image Award, and Being Propertied, Once Myself, Blackness and the End of Man, which is forthcoming. He is a junior fellow at the Society of Fellows at Harvard University, and he is the director of the June Jordan Fellowship Program at the Center for Justice at Columbia University. And this, I should say, is the second part of a two-part program that Joshua largely put together, where we're celebrating June Jordan's legacy. And the first part happened this fall at Columbia University, and it was an absolutely wonderful conversation between local poets, activists, and scholars, much like what we'll have today. Now that we've done that, now that you've met everybody in the room, let's meet the big person that's in the room. And I'm sure you all know her, and I'm sure you all are very familiar with her, because in her writing, she definitely revealed who she was to us all. But we have to celebrate the woman who we are here, have to talk about the woman who we are here to celebrate, June Jordan, right? The daughter of Jamaican-born Mildred and Granville Jordan. She was born in 1936 in Harlem and died in 2002 in Berkeley, California. In the 65 transformative years between those 2 years, she published nearly 30 books of poems, children's literature, political essays, wrote a column for The Progressive, taught at several universities, including Yale and UC Berkeley, which is where she established the Arts and Activism Poetry for the People program in 1991. An activist, she was engaged in the struggles for civil rights, women's rights, sexual freedom, and against militarization, police brutality, among the many things she discussed. She married, she divorced, she loved, she had a son, and she lived. She observed the world around her and wrote about it and worked to improve it, not simply for herself, but for all of us. She used her language to give voice to those who could not speak for themselves. And while she befriended literary giants like Toni Morrison and Pat Parker and Alice Walker and Adrienne Rich, she worked for the community. And in the tradition of poets and writers before her, like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, she elevated the use of non-standard English and advocated for self-awareness and acknowledging her whole self and wanting you to acknowledge your whole self. Jordan refused to deny any part of her life or experience, not even to publish. And I know the writers in the room are like, yeah, publishing is important, but you need your whole self, and she definitely lived that. Her words were eloquent and urgent and timeless and relevant and funny and sad and scathing and comforting, and I encourage you to go read her work. Yeah. Her work is widely available. She's one of the most widely read, prolific, and published writers that has ever graced us with her presence, and also her archives are right next door in the library. They're open. We open 6 days a week. So, she has this beautifully written essay, if you don't read anything else, The Difficult Miracle of Black Poetry in America. And in that essay slash sonnet, she says quite a few things that are absolutely transformative, I found. But among them, she sums it up to say, this is the difficult miracle of Black poetry in America, that we persist, published or not, and loved or unloved, we persist. So we are here today to talk about, to celebrate, and to continue on the legacy of this wonderful, wonderful woman, this wonderful, wonderful thinker, to celebrate the life and the works of the poet, the activist, the journalist, the scholar, the essayist, the biographer, a novelist, librettist, political visionary, daughter, mother, friend, lover, radical humanist, and still persistent Black woman, June Jordan. Wow.
My God. What else is there to be said? How are y'all doing this evening? Y'all all right? Okay, we got the right energy going already early. Thank you so much, Kenby, for that beautiful introduction to the event. If we could actually have one more round of applause for Kenby, Jen Kamensky, Alicia Hamilton. The June Jordan Fellowship began as a dream in my mind as a teenager, the idea that we could create a series of events where young people could come together, whether they were incarcerated or not, and create art. And so to see this event here with luminaries that I've studied and worked alongside for so much of the past, 7 or 8 years, means a great deal. So we're gonna jump right into it. I'm gonna decrease so the spirit can increase, because that's the tradition I was raised in. So we'll begin with Solmaz Sharif.
So I'm going to read a shortish talk on June written as a series of lessons. 1. I never actually met June Jordan. She stood once in the fall of 2001, shortly after 9/11, in the beginning of my first year at UC Berkeley, on the steps of Sproul Plaza, reading something into a microphone. I was late to class. I would see her later, I thought. She died before I could. This was her first lesson. 2. This is incorrect. Her first lesson to me was in the Borders bookstore on Westwood Boulevard, which was the one place I could go as a teen without explanation, the one place my parents would allow me to stay undisturbed until closing. There was an anthology of love poetry that I haven't been able to find since. In it, a poem by her called Taiko Dojo, Messages from Haruko. The poem is the word no repeated 65 times with varying punctuation. I hadn't heard taiko drums before, and I didn't know I was supposed to read the poem, its exclamations and hyphens, as percussion. Someone was not happy, I could tell, but otherwise I was troubled, annoyed even. Was this a poem? One word again and again? How was it enough? I remember that poem clearly, though, and forget every other one in that anthology, including one by Octavio Paz I found moving enough to copy for a crush. In her memoir, Soldier, she writes, quote, "Nobody bothered me when I was reading, except to make me eat or go to bed. It was peaceful to read. And sometimes I could feel the words kissing my face. I would put my nose close to the page, and because no one was watching me, sometimes I would just trip a word from the page to my eye, to my ear, to the page. The. So funny, I thought, such a soft, funny thing showing up again and again. The. And then in her posthumously published poem, Thoughts of a Teenage African Girl Standing on the Auction Block, June writes, that, no, that, no, the, mother, that, the, no tree, water, dirty, no air, no, hurt me, no. 3. A poem was a site of pleasure nowhere else in language. A poem was the pleasure available to us in language at all times, though denied. Any violence against that pleasure would be thrown into sharp relief in the poem. The, that, no, that. History could be interrogated by article, by preposition. A word was a note. She was a classically trained pianist, after all, a librettist, an urban planner, a teacher, an activist, a mother. All were present in every poem. A poem was irritating even because it was embarrassing to be moved, to be pleased, so without being able to explain why, to be pleased in public in my own privacy. This was perhaps her first lesson to me, though I've lost track. 4. Pleasure is not a word used too often by certain critics when they talk of June, rarely as they do. Nor is desire, though, as her posthumous collection tells us, she is directed by it. She is, Alice Walker writes, among the bravest of us, the most outraged, and that word rage follows her. Take, for example, this last review the New York Times ever published of June's work, of her selected essays, Some of Us Did Not Die, which was titled Rage, Rage. Too often, however, Jordan rants rather than reasons, trading an analysis of complex problems for self-righteous expressions of anger at the injustices of the world. Her indignant polemical reflections on affirmative action, black rage, or duplicity in the White House, and Some of Us Did Not Die, promise only to attract the attention of the already converted. Jordan's untamed energy and take no prisoners attitude served her well as an activist. They have served her less well as an essayist, end quote. The reviewer offers not one example of such rant, such indignant polemical reflection, so I can't eviscerate this reviewer's argument as I would like. But I point to this review because in the post-election world, in this nation that loves to be post, loves more than anything to hold on to the myth of the clean break and the unexpected surprise, rather than the inevitable grinding conclusions of its own unexamined psychic and material life, a number of poets found themselves in a distinctly American, they thought, crisis. They wanted to know where our poets of dissent were. They who had for years valued negative capability, that romantic posture of uncertainty penned in a letter by a 21-year-old in the British 19th century, and found that any naming of something political, even if that naming is simple description, as one might simply describe a nightingale or a Grecian urn, or any other weather surrounding our lives, was an obliteration to, rather than an entry to, mystery. They who still refuse to look closely at how their criteria for a good poem and a good nation have lined up. They who still refuse to see negative capability in thought leading to negative capability in action will ensure we will be stuck in a cultural eternity of hand-wringing and yes, but, or as a friend put more simply in grad school, you can't put the CIA or the FBI in a poem because those words are unpoetic. Well, sure, but whose fault is that? And sure, but what poet of these states did not fall for that charade of abstraction as profundity, as poetic, and yet did not cede beauty and pleasure and felicity and sex to ideology, nationalism, calcification, or any easy shelter that would be built upon exclusion necessary or not? June. And what poet was not named by any of these poets in crisis? June. And who does not have a steady publishing house? June. And who did not get reviewed much in the New York Times after she spoke out, for example, on Palestine? June. And who was removed from PEN America's board? June. And who was the white man talking about when after a reading he said that black woman over there should be burned alive in green fire, end quote? June. And whose poem included the FBI and the CIA and South Africa and Bedford-Stuy and Park Avenue and American Airlines and on in one edition of Norton Anthology of Modern Poetry, only to have it removed from the more recent editions. June. Whose poem about George Washington Carver, fine as it is, survived? June. And who is and remains our litmus test for, well, do you really want a poetry of dissent? Or do you want to hold on to your faith in goodness and greatness? June. Until this literary establishment, this American literary establishment, can find a way to talk about June's poetry, it is doomed. I mean to say every criticism leveled against June's work as I hear it, that it is too didactic, too angry, too difficult, too direct, too loose, too free, too untamed, too black, too sonorous, too big, too bi, too complicated, points to a national and cultural crisis that, until addressed, will doom us all. 5. June. Quote, "If you make my life horrible, then when I can tell the truth, it will be a horrible truth. It will not sound good or look good or, God willing, feel good to you either," end quote. 6. June. Quote, "In the context of tragedy, all polite behavior is a form of self-denial," end quote. 7. June as teacher. I use the name June despite having not met her because I speak to her often, even as I write this. It is absolutely impossible to write all of June. A bibliography would be much more useful, but briefly we can consider a fraction of what she did: an imagined redesign of Harlem with Buckminster Fuller, a children's book, a young adult novel, a Prix de Rome, an early era wherein she wore skirts, a later era wherein she ironed even, I hear, her jeans, even in the middle of Nicaragua, in the middle of a revolution, which is a place she wrote of, as she wrote of Lebanon, of Palestine, of Iran, the founding of radical teaching programs at CUNY, Teachers and Writers Collective, and finally at UC Berkeley, her Poetry for the People program, which she founded after decades of teaching when she found herself teaching an African American Studies course in literature and a Women's Studies course in literature. And one was made up mostly of black men and one mostly of white women. And there was no overlap, and they were having parallel conversations. And she said, well, this should be in one room. The room she called in the vision of Martin Luther King Jr., a beloved community. That room has been, for me, the greatest lesson of all. One, I never met June Jordan. Her name was on the schedule when I took Poetry for the People in the spring of 2002. She died that summer. She never made it to class, though it was often promised she might. And at the end of the very last student reading on the last day, the instructor read a poem on her behalf. This strikes me, all her writing life, and the one poem that she chose to leave us with. So I will read it now. On a New Year's Eve. Infinity doesn't interest me, not altogether anymore. I crawl and kneel and grub about, I beg and listen for what can go away as easily as love, or perish like the children running hard on one-way streets. Infinity doesn't interest me, not anymore. Not even repetition, your, my, I, lid, or the colorings of sunrise, or all the sky excitement added up is not enough to satisfy this lusting adulation that I feel for your brown arm before it moves, changes up the temporary sacred tales ago. First bike ride round the house when you first saw a squat opossum carry babies on her back. A possum up in the persimmon tree. You reeling toward that natural first absurdity with so much wonder still it shakes your voice. The temporary is the sacred, takes me out. And even the stars, and even the snow, and even the rain do not amount to much unless these things submit to some disturbance, some derangement, such as when I yield myself belonging to your unmistaken body. And let the powerful lock up the canyon, mountain peaks, the hidden rivers, waterfalls, the deep down minerals, the coal fields, gold fields, diamond mines, close by the whoring ore, hot at the center of the earth, spinning fast as numbers I cannot imagine. Let the world blot, obliterate, remove so-called magnificence, so-called almighty, fathomless, and everlasting treasures, wealth, whatever that may be. It is this time that matters. It is this history I care about, the one we make together, awkward, inconsistent as a lame cat on the loose, or quick as kids freed by the bell, or else as strictly once as only life must mean a once upon a time. I have rejected propaganda teaching me about the beautiful, the truly rare. Supposedly, the soft push of the ocean at the hush point of the shore, supposedly the soft push of the ocean at the hush point of the shore is beautiful, for instance. But the truly rare can stay out there. I have rejected that abstraction, that enormity, unless I see a dog walk on the beach, a bird sees sandflies, or yourself approach me, laughing out a sound to spoil the pretty picture, make an uncontrolled heart-beating memory instead. I read the papers preaching on that oil and oxygen, that redwoods and the evergreens, that trees, the waters, and the atmosphere, compile a final listing of the world in short supply, but all alive, and all the lives persist, perpetual, in jeopardy, persist, as scarce as every one of us, as difficult to find or keep, as irreplaceable, as frail as every one of us. And as I watch your arm, your brown arm, just before it moves, I know all things are dear that disappear. All things are dear that disappear.
Imani Perry.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I am grateful to be here. I met June Jordan once at a dinner where some person with extraordinary grace and generosity sat me between. Toni Morrison was on my left and June Jordan was on my right, and Derek Bell was in front of me. And I was a very young woman and thought I had died and gone to heaven. And the thing that was so beautiful about the moment for me, it wasn't a kind of an academic or a highbrow literati occasion. It was a dinner, and the dialogue was, for lack of a term that I could translate into standard English, was very down home. And I was thinking today that there is a direct relationship between the difficult miracle and the down home genius, and that there's something that she saw and heard in that at that crossroads, and that I am grateful to have witnessed. So I want to talk about a piece that she wrote titled "Report from the Bahamas, 1982." And I think generally there's work to be done about the idea of reportage, more work to be done about the idea of reportage in Black poetics, the way that it is citational of the kind of truncated and fictionally objective fashion of the way official stories are told. And then with their work, there's the morphing or the explosion or the expansion of form that opens up language as well as opens up history and functions as an invitation to reconsider reportage through a bricolage of documentation that sets aside dispassions and fictions of reportedly objectivity. So in the report, she describes traveling to the Bahamas and staying in the Sheraton British Colonial. And at first she contemplates an image of a middle-aged Black man, this is as part of the advertising of the hotel, middle-aged Black man in a tuxedo who is smiling, and he's serving white customers while both of his feet, his shoes, and the bottom 10 inches of his trousers are immersed in the salt water. And she writes, "He's so delighted to serve you, he will wade into the water to bring you banana daiquiris while you float." Right? She says sarcastically. Right? And then she moves from that to a message in the room from the Ministry of Tourism that is this brief story of New World history. It's kind of a flyer, and the flyer traces the thread of empire. So it describes waves of conquest, Columbus, then the American loyalists who fled to the Bahamas in the aftermath of the Revolutionary War, and then the Confederates who arrived there after the Civil War defeat, right? And she notes that legitimate history, as it's conceived, tracks Europeans who barge into new territory. And at once, though, in the citation of this flyer, it's at once a single story of empire, and as well, there's kind of shards of a million stories of place and particularity, and she moves really beautifully between the two over the course of the piece. And when she turns to contemplate herself, she really deals with a vexation about how she's situated in the world. Right? So on the one hand, she describes herself as being, quote, about to have a West Indian fit over that man standing in the water, ruining his shoes and his pants, right? But then she compares herself to him, right? And talks about how with all of her choices, all the choices that are available to her in her life, she's a rich woman, a rich American woman, right? Who, like the other Black Americans who are staying in the Sheraton British Hotel, my Colonial Hotel, along with their white counterparts, have come to the Bahamas as tourists, and then she talks about how they all sort of argue down the price of handmade goods at the straw market, sold by women who must sell them in order to eat. And she says, and so it continues this weird succession of crude intruders that now includes me and my brothers and sisters from the North. Right? And the North, in that moment, it's a beautifully ambiguous signifier, right? So it has a particular signification in African American letters, right, of the kind of an escape to freedom. But it's also the position that now allows her or enables her to function as an intruder in a long history of intruders in the Bahamas, right? So on the one hand, there's this tradition in African American letters of mobility as a sign of freedom. But this is also an instance in which it can operate as a sign of becoming part of the colonial project. So Jordan sees all of this, all her position of relative power, her Americanness, notwithstanding her blackness and West Indianness, right, within the relations of exploitation and consumption. And yet, she also notes, she has to watch her coins on vacation, and she comments that she isn't white after all, right? So she has to budget the money she spends for this particular kind of pleasure. So the kind of narrative force that takes you through, that drives the piece, gives it a kind of nuance that I think is really important and is much richer, really, than merely observing what we popularly call today intersectionality, although in a sense the essay is about that, right? She's at the crossroads of multiple identities. But she's also talking about the multiple forces that are acting on people in their midst, that are shaping each of in her midst, the relations to power and wealth. And she's not simply asserting that fact, but she's moving through the trip in the essay and attending to encounters, and human encounters, and what fracturing or intimacy they bear based upon the order of relations and power. And even further, she asks throughout, what would the conditions be that might make intimacy, which is the foundation for solidarity, possible? Right? So then she describes the woman who cleans her room, a woman named Olive. And she wonders what sense Olive, if she were to ask her, would make of her decision to stay in this Sheraton. And in particular, to say she confesses that she has chosen to stay in this corporate hotel, the Sheraton, because they are under the protection of a multinational corporation. She was less likely to be harassed or attacked by men. And she says, a black woman seeking refuge in a multinational corporation may seem like a contradiction to some, but there you are, right? Right. And then she ventriloquizes Olive, right, and imagines that her response would probably be a judgmental one, right, wondering why would you travel this far without your husband anyway, right? Which is another logic of protection built inside the constraints of the world as it is, right, filled with both patriarchy and capitalism. Right? And Jordan doesn't have a clear answer to that question. She thinks, my rights and my freedom and my desire and a slew of other new world values, what would they sound like to this black woman described on the card atop my hotel bureau as Olive the maid? Right? And she speculates that Olive would have no reason to worry about Jordan's freedoms to choose a corporation to stay in as long, or to not travel without a husband, that she'd have no reason to worry about them so long as Jordan didn't give a damn about hers. And that's really an instructive moment for the reader, right, about politics, right, what kind of politics you have. So there's a series of other encounters. One is with a Jewish novelist whose story of dealing with her overbearing Talmudic scholar father resonates with June Jordan's own life. Another is a story of a relationship with a Jewish student whose enchantment with Yiddish and the manner in which the syntax and the literary deployment of Yiddish was a way of breaking through ghettoization, of being captured inside, yet marginalized, that connected with her own love of Black English. And then she describes that this resonance falls apart in a conversation with him when he says he doesn't really care about the danger to the federal student loan program because it wouldn't affect him. And then she notes that the loss of that program would jeopardize her own son's attendance at college, right? So she's the instructor, right? She has an encounter with a graduate student who's a white woman who says that to June Jordan, you're lucky because you have issues that give you purpose, like poverty and police brutality and discrimination, right? But then, this is important, she says the student also who says this describes herself as a housewife and a mother, in other words, nobody. And she says she did not believe she was a person precisely because she had fulfilled the traditional female functions. Right? So you see, I mean, she's reading these layers and through the encounters. And as the encounters move forward, we learn that, and so she's recalling the past, but also in the present moment in the Bahamas, and we learn she's there during Holy Week. And the encounters really structurally function like the Passions of the Cross, right? Traditionally celebrated during Holy Week, but the choreography is unreliable, right? And yet as a refrain, she places the gospel hymn, the old rugged cross, in the piece, right? And the issue is that, you know, the way that I read it is that the Easter miracle is at risk, she's saying, right? Because the suffering is not redemptive, or if it is, it's not righteous, right? She tells us a little story about irritating a woman at a sandwich shop because she's ordering so much food, and the woman is sort of like, why are you eating food? Because you're supposed to be fasting, because it's Good Friday, right? And the lesson for me is that, and one that she states quite explicitly is that a series of assumptions that we make about connection along lines of identity categories are wrong, right? That the identity categories or even the histories of marginalization are insufficient grounds for connection, right? Having a common enemy isn't enough, she says, right? The substance of the encounter, the moment of mutuality and what might come of that is what matters. And she says, she describes as the need that we find between ourselves. And the report concludes with a story of a Black South African woman whose husband, they're both political organizers who she's been working with, and this woman has to flee her husband's brutality and alcoholism. And she has an Irish-American woman friend who is able to intervene in sort of working with this woman to provide safety. And she refuses the idea that this is a kind of neat Pollyanna-ish sort of tying things up, look, we're all the same, because in the midst of that, this extraordinary moment of connection and sharing, she recalls the taunts of Irish kids in her youth, calling her by slurs, right? And so really what she hones in on is the work of witnessing, right? So, and that this woman that these women are able to witness, or the Irish American woman who's was able to witness the South African woman's experience in a way that allows her to help her navigate safely through it. So I'm going to stop in a moment, but I'll just say I wanted to talk about this piece for a couple of reasons. One is that I really appreciate these kind of multiple vertices of position and identity and social reality that she puts forth again and again, and it's a sort of, it's an encounter that resonates for me because as a Black person having visited the Bahamas, all kinds of thoughts of these sorts come into your mind about class and power and relations of domination and exploitation. And then she talks about the multiplicity of who she is. She's West Indian, she's American, she's middle class, she's class insecure, she's rich, she is a woman protected from black men by a corporation, she is an indecent woman because she travels alone, right? And she cautions us against this idea that is still trafficked in quite a bit, if not more now than then, that the categorical identity tells you most of what you need to know about struggling together, or about whether you're privileged or bourgeois or poor and oppressed. And I also love it because she's radically honest about how she navigates these relations of power at times to her own advantage, right? That's the conundrum that we find ourselves in a society structured the way this is, in a world structured the way it is, right? And finally, for my own work on gender, in which I've tried to sort of draw the architecture of patriarchy, and the patriarch of all his ancillary figures surrounding him. I try to explore what that question of, explore what that is. Part of what I'm also trying to figure out is how do we approach its undoing? And we have to ask how we might be moved towards disrupting relations of domination by responding to what the term I like that Stanley Cavell uses is the passionate utterance, right? A suggestion of another way of being with one another, that we might move towards different relations, something closer to ethical relations, and with the first step of being able to fully listen, right? And in a sense, what June Jordan is doing in this piece is both listening for impassioned utterances and also offering one. And perhaps most telling in that regard is that this story doesn't arrive on Easter, right? And she talks about it being Good Friday, but Easter doesn't come explicitly in the piece. The marking of time in it remains with Good Friday, the period of waiting and wondering about salvation.
To bring us home, Mariame Kaba.
Thank you. So people often get up on these occasions and say that it's really an honor to be in the space with everyone here. And they usually will then thank the organizers of the event for their hard work. And then they're going to say that they're really thrilled to be sharing the stage with illustrious co-panelists who they greatly admire. And then they'll say that, they need to take a moment to actually thank the audience for showing up in a terrible snowstorm that's about to start. And who I know you all want to get home as soon as possible. And that's what people usually say at times like these, and those are all true for me. But also for me, WTF, I cannot believe that I was invited to speak at an event commemorating the legacy of June Jordan. June Jordan, who has been a touchstone of mine, really, since I first read her work in college, which was many, many years ago. And so I really can't believe that I'm here today, and I'm really grateful to be here with all of you to celebrate her legacy and her life. June Jordan loved Black people, and so do I. She was an educator, and so am I. She was an activist, and so am I. She was an internationalist, and so am I. She was a brilliant writer, and I am not at all, so bear with me. Before I was anything, though, I was a youth worker, and I was this when I was 15, and I am still at 46. Youth workers teach, we mentor, we advocate, we counsel, we console. Most of all, we love young people. When I read Jordan's essay, Nobody Mean More to Me Than You, and the Future Life of Willie Jordan, the youth worker in me recognized myself and the now hundreds of young people I've taught, counseled, and loved over the past decades. So this brings me to Michael, to the future life of Michael. Michael's been shot, the voice on the phone says. He's alive, he'll recover. I breathe easier, temporarily relieved. It's a reprieve. Michael is 18 and on borrowed time. He reminds me regularly that he's not long for this world. I've heard the words in some variations so often that they now pour off me like water from a shower head. What is the antidote to this certainty about one's impending death? How does one live with the specter of death as constant companion? The certainty is a thief. It robs me of language. I've lost my tongue. I want to break my silence to say that I love him, and I would be devastated if he didn't live until he's at least 100. But I don't respond. I pretend that I don't hear the words. I'm numb, and after all, I can't guarantee that he will live to become an old man. He's young, he's black, he's poor. He lives on the south side, the west side of Chicago. So I steel myself for bad news every morning, and this time it arrives. Michael belongs to the tribe of the young and the unmoored. His body is passing through, and he has no expectations of staying. We rode on the L together once. Michael's voice boomed throughout the trip. I asked him to lower it. He looked at me for a moment and kept loud talking. I was embarrassed at his display, and I felt disrespected that he ignored my request. These are emotions that youth workers often feel. As soon as we got off the L, his voice returned to its normal decibel level. I asked why he spoke so loudly on the train. His response? I want them uncomfortable, and they need to know that I was here. My anger dissipated. I've never forgotten his words. They're seared in my mind. They need to know that I was here. We've never spoken of what it's like to feel not here. In Michael's words, I hear June Jordan's. I will no longer lightly walk behind a one of you who fear me. Be afraid. I plan to give you reasons for your jumpy fits and facial tics. I will not walk politely on the pavements anymore. I must become a menace to my enemies. Michael is in fact a menace to society, a problem to be managed, controlled, and contained by any means necessary. He knows it and is expected to swallow his rage as he is surveilled in stores and on the streets, as he is targeted by cops for endless stops and frisks, as he is repeatedly denied jobs, as his schools are closed, as he looks over his shoulder dodging bullets, and as he is locked in cages with thousands who look just like him. A young man who has been behind bars for most of his formative years has told me on more than one occasion that he was always certain his life held only two viable possibilities: die in the streets or die in prison. Jordan tells us that most Americans have imagined that problems affecting Black life follow from pathogenic attributes of Black people and not from the malfunctions of the state. I've been a witness to the malfunctions of every Chicago institution, schools, government, law enforcement, and more, malfunctions which pile up and crush hope. Poet and teacher Kevin Koval has written, "Every institution in Chicago fails Black youth. Segregated and systematically inequitable, Chicago is a town where white kids exist in an increasingly idyllic new urban utopia, and Black and Latino kids weave and dodge through a war zone." Michael has been in and out of confinement since he was 13. My work has meant being a witness to the everyday damage that incarceration does to the future prospects of so many people who get caught in a system of arrest, jail, surveillance, and rearrest. This cycle makes it harder for individuals to find and hold on to stable housing, jobs, and relationships. It aggravates mental health and substance abuse problems. Prisons are not places for transformation, and they are not appropriate social service providers. Incarceration is a traumatic experience. People spend years after their release working to heal. Michael is unhealed still. I visit Michael in the hospital, and I hate hospitals. He smiles wanly. I burst into tears. The temporary relief I feel is quickly replaced by dread that can't be dislodged in the pit of my stomach. I worry about retaliation. I worry that violence begets more violence. I worry about Michael. This is a young man living in exile in his own country. His humanity is unacknowledged. He languishes in a place that Richard Wright has called no man's land, or maybe it's the place June Jordan called otherwhere. He is allowed no feelings. He is just a threat. All of our fears rest on and in him. I remember our ride on the L and his words to me. They need to know that I was here. and I recognize that he is demanding to be seen in all of his humanity by the larger world. Yet one constant throughout American history is a persistent denial of Black humanity and a callous disregard of Black pain. June Jordan understood this all too well, but she was not defeated by it. She insisted that by organizing, we have the power to overcome oppression. I too believe this to be true. She was righteously outraged. I am too. As far as I know, Michael hasn't taken part in the ongoing movement for Black Lives protests and organizing. His struggle is to live day to day. His resistance is to stay alive, and he is courageous in his personal fight. June talked a lot about courage, the courage of South Africans fighting against apartheid, and of students sitting in to insist that Columbia and Harvard divest from it. She reminded us of the truth that only evil will collaborate with evil. Were she alive today, I believe that she'd tell us that the prison industrial complex is evil, and we must not collaborate. We must refuse. For me, that refusal is rooted in an abolitionist politic. As Dean Spade says, we see the abolition of policing, prisons, jails, and detention not strictly as a narrow answer to imprisonment and the abuses that occur within prisons, but also as a challenge to the rule of poverty, violence, racism, alienation, and disconnection that we face every day. Abolition is the practice of transformation in the here and now and the ever after. I've organized for many years alongside young people, so I am, of course, inspired by the high school students who are currently in the streets, demanding a change to gun laws and saying that they refuse to be used for target practice. But their activism is not new. We've seen young people of color, particularly young Black and brown people, facing down tanks, demanding policy change and insisting that Black Lives Matter for 5 years now. And we've seen their forebearers for 50 and 100 years before. It's been 6 years since the Dream Defenders descended on Tallahassee, Florida, to occupy the Capitol when Trayvon Martin was killed almost 6 years ago next Monday. They demanded an end to racist stand-your-ground gun laws then. We like to forget, to unsee what has already happened in this country, particularly if the people we need to remember and see are of color, or LGBTQ, or poor, or undocumented, or Muslim, or. Sonia Sanchez encourages us to call on our residual memories. She reminds us that in political struggle, we must call on our ancestors who can help us to navigate the trials of our present. She is speaking about the importance of spirituality in whatever form that it might manifest for you. Quote, "We must hear the voices and have the dreams of those who came before us, and we must keep them with us in a very real sense. This will keep us centered," unquote. Aren't we blessed that June Jordan is one of the ancestors who we can call on and hear her voice to keep us centered in this current stormy weather? What can we hear from her in this moment? I think that love is a requirement of principled struggle, both self-love and love of others. That we must all do what we can. That it is better to do something rather than nothing. That we have to trust others as well as ourselves. I often repeat the adage that hope is a discipline. We must practice it daily. June's work teaches us this truth. And tonight, it is my privilege to stand with you a poem written on September 11th, 2001. Jordan tells us, "Resolving to work harder than I have ever worked for the sake of justice, which is the only true path to peace." This is written several months before she dies in 2002. So I'm calling on all of us to do the same, to secure the future life of all of the Michaels and the Michelles in our country and beyond. Thank you.
So, hi, everybody. Thank you all for brilliant, beautiful, thoughtful, loving presentations. I wanted to ask, first of all, just about teaching June Jordan's work, right? And where for you all teaching her work in the contemporary moment, where are the moments of surprise in the teaching, right? Where are you finding that the poems and the essays really sort of cut across the way many of our students are being socialized to think in the contemporary moment, whether it's about identity, right, which has already come up, or whether or not CIA and FBI are poetic words or not, right? Or even about temporality and life expectation, right? What they can expect from a full life. So I was wondering if you could all talk about that for a bit.
So the class where I teach June Jordan's work in two classes. One is Introduction to African American Studies, and the other, though, which I guess is the more surprising one, is I teach a course on Black women and social policy. And I don't know if it's quite, it's surprising, particularly for those who major in political science or public policy, to get poems in a policy class. But there's something about the kind of register, connecting to the kind of both the ethical questions and the interior life that you get in the poetry that is not accessible to them in the same way in the sort of in the history or the politics books and so it actually gives it allows for an interpretation and an understanding of that material that's much richer, actually, right? When you actually can be inside the lives of people. And so for me, it's a real sort of pedagogical lesson, but it's also a lesson as a student of what kinds of work is necessary to understand, right? For us to read, for us to sort. So so that's the.
So I sometimes teach in prisons. Particularly in juvenile detention centers in the last few years. And I guess it was right after Eric Garner was killed. I taught a class with students at the JTDC, the Juvenile Temporary Detention Center, Cook County, and we read her poem about police violence, which the beginning is, "Tell me something. What you think would happen if every time they kill a black boy, then we kill a cop? Every time they kill a black man, then we kill a cop. You think the accident rate would lower subsequently?" And it was really something for those young people on the inside. One of the young people said to me, did they get her for that? Like, is she okay? Like, you know what I mean? Like, what, like, just could not fathom that anybody could write those words now.
Yeah.
And that tells you everything you need to know about the surprise and the relevancy of those terms today, and what would have happened had June been alive in 2014 and had put that poem out on the internet. What would have happened on Facebook or on Twitter for those lines to be posted by a writer today? So I always think about like the fact, in some ways, how far back we've regressed as much as we've progressed. And again, for young people to be so stunned that anybody would write these words and not have the FBI grab them from their house, as many have been grabbed in the current moment. So I think about that a lot. I think about the things that people could write in the past that can't be written today, and because of social media, frankly. And because that is just a different kind of thing. You're writing it into the ether, and it is consumed by any number of people. But you could have done it before in a book that nobody would have seen. And you could have read it in a room with like-minded people who wouldn't report you to the cops. So I think that changes the life of the young folks who are organizing today very much. And so when they see those kinds of things, they think to themselves, you definitely can't do that now. So I think about that a lot.
I think about, I teach her work mostly I mostly teach creative writing workshops, so that's where I teach her work. And one of the things that continues to be surprising to me whenever I revisit her and teach her is how instructive her essays are. So that even, for example, Report from the Bahamas, which is an argument for a kind of connection and a building of connection, she gives a very specific example of how that was done, albeit messily and imperfectly, by herself, between two students, that Irish woman and the South African student, and how, she does not rest on the kind of diagnostic, observational mode of writing, but is constantly pushing into action. A lot of her essays will break into bullet points of here's what I did next, right? Here are the actions that we undertook as students organizing against something. Here's what my breast cancer means to me in my daily life. And you have this sense always of a presence that is invested not just in your intellect and your mind and your curiosity, but your very life, And so to be able to teach her as a writer that can model that and what it might mean to write activism into your work creatively without losing sight of the emotional, visceral intelligence that's really driving the work, I think she's a rare gift in that way of allowing for that conversation to unfold.
That's great. All right, we're gonna keep going in case anyone has questions. The microphone is open. So can we talk a bit more then about June as an organizer, right? Because here I'm thinking too about poetry for the people and how it becomes the embodiment of a certain kind of philosophical vision, right? That for her, the people is capacious. It's trans-ethnic, transracial, right? It crosses all these different boundaries. And so I was wondering if you could each speak a bit about sort of the greatest lesson that June has given you in that regard, in terms of how is she opening the way that you're thinking about the collaboration between arts and politics, or arts and events organizing, or even arts in the classroom?
Well, I'll say a thing that stands out to me about Poetry for the People always is shortly after the Gulf War broke out, the first Gulf War broke out, June apparently came to class, the student teacher poet class, and dropped a translated Quran on the table and said, Arab and Arab American poetry is not being taught on this campus, and we need to teach it. Now, there are 5 million ways that conversation could have been stopped. One, for example, the Quran is not to be translated, right? The Quran is also not necessarily the book of faith for all Arabs. The Quran, this move itself is so problematic and ethically messy and dangerous in a lot of ways that a lot of people would just stop and prevent it from happening. And so for me, it's always, the question is always, what is the thing that's not happening? How do I make that thing happen in the classroom rather than wait for the expert that would knowingly and respectfully, educate us all on this? Like, knowledge is a thing that is creatively and collectively made, and we have to make it, and it's going to be a messy enterprise. That's one thing I think about quite often. And the other thing I think about was a very difficult conversation and position that she would push us in Poetry for the People as I inherited it, which was that, for example, we had an assignment wherein everyone in that class had to write a poem in Black English. Now, first we studied Black English. We studied it as a language with certain grammatical rules. We studied it as a language with a history that traces back to certain West African languages. It was broken down for us rule by rule historically. And the argument that she was giving us was, either you accept that Black English is a language, and as such should be learned and can be learned, or you don't. And why is it, on the other side of that, why is it that some of us are forced into a King's English, into that discomfort, and never have to experience any comparable discomfort, right? That workshop was always a mess. Who am I in the end to workshop somebody's poem in Black English if it's violating the rules as it's laid down for me, but is the Black English that they grew up with and they know and they speak, right? So it was always it was a firestorm to kind of walk into. And for me, that sense of feeling threatened to your core is the sense that she constantly pushes me toward in teaching and in her poetry and in the classroom and beyond.
So, I mean, June Jordan, there's a way in which she's connected to the foundation of Black Studies, which was explicitly, it's going to take me a little bit roundabout way to get to your answer. It was explicitly political at the outset, right? That it was connected to, at least in terms of higher education, that Black Studies is connected to the freedom movement. And then there's this transition that happens in the 80s and more intensively in the 1990s, where in the quest to seek kind of real academic legitimacy, the depoliticization of Black studies was undertaken so that it wasn't treated simply as, okay, these are the courses we have to have so the Black kids don't take over the president's office, right? Her lesson around really refusing to take the politics out of the work because it is political work, whether or not you acknowledge it. I mean, I think that the Black English example is perfect. And for me, when teaching Black English within an Intro to African American Studies course, it winds up, even in that instance, being a firestorm because it is, there's such deep feelings of anxiety, but also conceptions of fundamental illegitimacy to the way Black people speak that even some Black students hold that it is. So when you have things like that are case, then Black Studies is fundamentally political, right? And so for her to spend a career embracing that as a truth, I think is for me an important lesson, not just because of my politics, but because I want to be a rigorous scholar and a good teacher. And then I say the other piece, there's this perennial question, not question, but accusation, right, about politics and art, so that somehow makes it sort of less likely to be good art or true art, right? But I also think that what she is a testimony to is politics as art, right? So that the crafting of one's life and the seeking of beauty that is political work. And so that kind of, for me, that turning it on its head also sort of gets away from kind of a set ideas of what you have to do in the freedom struggle as opposed to thinking about how we can be experimental and creative. And so I think that's another instance in which what she's done as an educator, right? How do you exist in the university with politics directed towards liberation, right? Those kinds of, she's a model.
Yeah, I think picking up on Imani's last point, which is, a lesson is organize where you are with the people who are the community in which you actually are living. And so she taught that by organizing on campus, which is where she spent a hell of a lot of her time, organizing with students, alongside students, whether it was building the Attica Defense Committee or working around the South Africa divestment programs and being an inspiration to the students who took that charge to actually put their bodies on the line. And her saying, I'll be with you, putting my body on the line alongside, is a really important part of what it means to be an organizer. I think, there is a difference between people who are organizers and activists. Yeah. It's like there's actually a big difference there. And I think that it gets very blurry for folks in the current moment. But if you're an organizer, you're developing leaders more than you are the person out front on Lone Ranger wearing a blue vest. But I'm just saying, that's a real thing. That's a real thing. There's a difference between being an organizer tied to a community that you're accountable to and speaking for yourself on behalf of no one else. Yeah. I think we have to be real about those things because it's a real struggle. So that's one. I think the other issue we really have to be mindful about is, to me, the fact that art is absolutely necessary to social movements. In fact, that social movements themselves are a form of collective art making. Mm. Like, I don't think people can, I think you have to understand that that's the case. And I think, Jeff Chang said years ago that cultural change precedes political change. Yeah. That's right. And what can artists do the best is work on culture and help us be able to do that work. It's not that, it's so often you see that happening. And because the cultural change demands imagination, and art can do a really good job of lifting the ceiling off your imagination, right? To allow you to think of things that you never would have imagined before. And I was, the thing that shifted for us in Chicago, I was the co-lead organizer of a campaign for reparations for police torture survivors, which we won a couple of years ago in Chicago, the first of its kind, right? Yeah. And how did we come to create that campaign? That campaign came not from the law, when people fought for years and years and years to try to get the police officers convicted. And then when one of them finally went to trial and was convicted, they got 4 years. And then all these people who'd been tortured for 20 years were left thinking, this is it? This is what we got? So the court doesn't produce justice. The court enforces the law. That's very different. And so we were left bereft. People didn't have money. People needed their needs. The material needs that you need to live were unmet. People were still having nightmares. There was no psychological offering of services, right? These were things. And it was through art and an imagination of how would we memorialize this torture that Joey Mogul wrote this ordinance that was this emancipatory abolitionist document that said this is going to be a reparations demand. That's what we're going to fight on. We're going to fight on this. And we're going to ask for all sorts of stuff that's not just money, right? And that was through an art project. Yeah. So that's very, very important, I think, for people to be thinking about on a regular basis. And, we need, one of the things about organizing is that we're often very reactive by necessity. We have to be. What art does is it helps you, force you to be visionary. And that's so incredibly necessary in organizing. So I think that, she knew those things and tried to live them, didn't always live up to it. I think was honest about that. So I think those are some of the things that come to mind as I think about lessons to learn from the work, and that work being the art that allows for the foundation from which we can actually fight and win.
That's beautiful. I think we have our first question. Okay, great. Nice.
First of all, thank you for everybody who made this event possible. Excuse me, because I'm a novice to June Jordan. I saw this event online, and I was like, all right, this seems like something to do. And so, as a novice and taking all the information that y'all are putting out, can you tell me what kind of, not just a lesson per se, but what's the favorite thing or aspect, characteristic about June Jordan that you would like to impress upon folks like myself who are novice to her work and her living legacy? So what would really that characteristic, or doesn't have to be one thing, of course, but what would you like to impress upon those who don't know as much, but can clearly see by Radcliffe doing this that she did something real good? So appreciate y'all.
Thank you. Well, I mean, just for me, she took very seriously the voices of children. I think it was a central component of Jordan's ethos, her writing, her thinking that children had their own culture, their own ideas, and that part of why the world hates children, she writes, is that they remind us of the vulnerability in ourselves, right? And so for me, reading her work first in grad school, right, The Future Life of Willie Jordan was that first essay that I came across, and it just struck me that someone would ground so much of their thinking in that experience, right? The idea that young people had something invaluable to contribute. So I think that was my one major lesson, and that sort of spurred my desire to constantly be thinking with Jordan for the rest of my life.
It's hard to say, but I would say her laughter, actually. And if you could listen to her laughter, and also the humor that she brings to her work in the most difficult, and it's scathing, it's snarling, it's tender, it's, it's just so dexterous and nimble and necessary, I think, to the work, the very difficult work that she was doing and after.
She loved Black people unapologetically and overtly and deeply. And it that shouldn't be surprising, but in some ways it is, given the landscape we are. So that, and that actually is the grounds, right, out of which she has an international politics. She has a, that moves across categories of identity and immigration status and location and social position. But that is the grounds, to me, is so important, but also inspiring, and I don't know, it's one of those things that's like a guide, right? And you can,
I think two things for me. I always loved her righteous outrage. Like, if you read her, she's like, this is fucked up.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? Like, and that's like so refreshing. It's not like, things are hard and oppression exists. Like, it's like, this sucks, I really love that, and that was what drew me to her. Like, I think it was my feminist philosophy professor, Peter Tancred out of McGill, who first introduced her writing to us. This was the late 80s. And we were just all like, oh my God, like, we totally relate to her. And then I think the second thing is that she embraced being difficult. She did, for Black women, when you are supposed to make yourself small all the time in order not to get your head blown off by everybody, like, literally, you're swiveling on trying not to get shot in all different directions, both figuratively and literally. I think that she embraced that. Like, she would just be like, somebody would interview her and they'd say, we really see your work as blase blah. And she'd say, nope. Yeah. That's not what I was thinking. Do you know what I mean? Like, that ain't it. So I don't know what you're thinking about. You know what I mean? Like, and like, she would just push back in that kind of way, which people term difficult because they just don't want you to speak back. You know what I mean? They just want you to take it. So, so I love those two things about her. And I think if you read more of her work,
which I will,
you totally get to it. You're gonna love the fact that that's like, fuck this, and it's great. All right. Yeah.
Appreciate everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.